ethical considerations, then we have a problem, right? It's very difficult to sort of to garner that concept from this little bit of information, but this is what I do for a living. So the idea that I want to sort of put in your mind now is we're going to have a problem when observational data takes precedence over ethical considerations, right? It should be the other way around, right? So the idea, and I do have red, I don't have a red one, bastards. Okay, so 3, it should be the case that ethical considerations take precedence, right, over observational data. Right? We are more concerned with ethical considerations, right, than we are with observational data, right? Precedence is on ethical considerations. The problem, however, is if this is inversed, right? If we inverse this relationship and we put observational data as being the primary focus of our research, over ethical considerations, right? This whole thing is wrong, right? So what you want to do as a qualitative researcher, and this is, again, this is introductory, is you want to make sure that you factor into your IRB proposal, probably, right? When you send your projected research to the review board, you want to make sure that insofar as you're presenting your research, and this isn't just obviously for graduate students, I mean this lecture series is primarily geared for graduate students, but I would imagine researchers watch this as well, and this is probably redundant, I'm sure you know this, you might use these lectures to facilitate your already existing knowledge, but the idea is simple, right? Insofar as I am conducting qualitative methods research, I want to make sure that in incorporating and assessing the ethics of my research, I always do so not in placing precedence on observational data over ethical considerations, but in properly thinking about the ethical considerations, effects, and so on of my research above the observational data, right? Considerations first, observational data and assessment as a consequence of ethical considerations. So hopefully that's painfully obvious. I would hope so. And for those of you who are watching me for the first time, the way that I teach, I call it ghetto philosophy, right? I'm sort of irreverent. The way that I teach is I want to present the information in the first 10, 15, 20 minutes in its most mundane, absolutely duh level. And as we progress throughout the lecture series, and obviously these lecture series that I do are hours long, as we progress through the lecture series, if I build that foundation, and if you follow me from video to video, as we build that foundation, that sort of ghetto philosophy foundation, what I can then do in progressively more advanced sort of pedagogical modes is I substitute sort of the ghetto philosophy with jargon and technical concepts, so that by the end of the lecture series, once we get to the last few hours of the lecture series, I'll be talking in pure jargon, and hopefully at that point you'll understand, right? But right now, this is to entice you to understand the concepts and the development of the lecture. Okay, so 1939 to 1945, German scientists conduct research on concentration camp prisoners. The idea of prisoners is also important. We'll talk later, much later in the lecture series, about vulnerable populations, right? We'll talk about at-risk populations, and one of the first recognitions from the atrocities of the concentration camp was a realization that it was diabolical because of the prisoners' confinement, right? The confinement of the prisoners and their inability to escape whatever scenarios manifested sort of led to huge ethical considerations with not just respect to prisoners as vulnerable populations, but the idea of vulnerable populations as such, and we'll talk about that later, right? So for me, when I see prisoners, it's a mental cue to discuss the notion of vulnerable populations, and I'll do that later. Right? Then 1940, page 1, last bit, 1947, the Nuremberg Code for research on human subjects is adopted, right? So there's a code now in which we're going to make an international attempt to regulate the conduct of research, right? This is going to be a standard by which we want to regulate research conduct. The Allies used the document in the Nuremberg trials to convict Nazi scientists for war crimes. I want to read some of this, right? The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, right? This doesn't just apply to biomedical ethics considerations. This doesn't just apply to quantitative methods considerations. It also applies to qualitative methods considerations, right? Insofar as we social scientists prepare our field work, right? And we conceptualize what data qualitative data we're trying to assess in society. We have to make sure that the consent of those individuals is at the forefront, right? We want individuals to willingly consent to divulge X, Y, Z, right? Coercion and force and such doesn't lead to good results, and I'll talk about that later, right? So the voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential, right? So we want to make sure we get voluntary consent. We want to get voluntary consent of human subjects is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have a legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, right? So, I'm not going to put on my philosopher hat now and talk about free will in a philosophical conception, free will in the general conception, right? So there should be free will, right? The participant can freely exercise his or her consent, independent to any coercion or external factors forcing or encouraging participation in the research. The person says, hey, that sounds like something that could benefit me, my community, blah, 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 your research, I'm willing to participate. Without the intervention of, as I just said, without the intervention of any elements of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior forms of constraints or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision, right? So not only is it the case that insofar as we're conducting, for the purpose of this lecture series, qualitative methods research, the participant should willingly consent to participate in the exercise, in the research. There is a sense in which the participant needs to have an understanding of the nature of the experiment, right? So we can see with respect to the atrocities that befell the Tuskegee syphilis study, right, participants were not aware of the conditions of the experiment. We want to make sure that that with respect to maintaining the viability of the experiment, the participant recognizes whatever dangers there might be in his or her participation, right? These dangers might manifest, and later in the lecture series, not at this level, I'll talk not just about participant considerations, but also, especially in qualitative methods research, third-party considerations, but that's much later in the series. So this later element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences, the hazards reasonable to be expected, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on, right? You should know the hazards, the inconveniences, the methods by which it's going to be conducted, and so on, right? So it's voluntary consent, but consent is itself contingent on information. So the participant should be well informed, right? So it's, I would hope, sort of obviously, glaringly obvious as to the nature of consent and participation of the subject, right? You want to make sure that the subject recognizes the hazards. And probably for us, qualitative, I was just thinking for a second when I did my qualitative assessment, I interviewed several Holocaust survivors about their experience, and obviously one of the things that could really jeopardize the subject in my particular research was sort of revisiting those stories, right? Revisiting a dark time in my past, right? That could be problematic. People don't necessarily always act in the way that you think they would act in revisiting some painful memory. Some people can revisit it sort of in a third-person sense, despite the fact it's their own story, right? In a more objective sense. Here's what happened on this day, objectively list the facts. Other people, in revisiting the story, we'll talk about this later as well, they not only revisit the story, but they, in a sense, relive the experience, right? And for those people who relive the experience, if they know that that's where the questions are going, they might not want to participate in the study because they know how their brain works, right? So it's always good practice as a qualitative researcher to make sure that you inform the participant as much as possible about the potential dangers and the potential hazards that your research may or may not pose on them. Okay, so the next aspect on page 2 are the essential elements of ethical consideration. So let's look into that.